Hello, thank you for watching Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. I want to talk today about, we see things like the wage gap, something that is provably wrong. We see things like the financial crisis, and it seems like the media is not really accurately portraying reality. Now, if they can't explain what's going on today in front of their eyes, can we really trust them to tell us about history and the history of the Federal Reserve, the history of how we got into wars? They can't tell us the truth about Syria. So to talk about this subject, I have the author of one of my favorite books, The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations and the American Decline by James Perloff. James, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you so much for having me on Don't Tread on Anyone. A good title for the show.
Thanks. James, what is a conspiracy and what is a conspiracy theorist?
Well, a conspiracy would be any combination of people planning in secret some action with a harmful purpose and outcome. And conspiracy theorist is sort of a loaded term because the CIA decided back in the 1960s to use that as a term to discredit people who were trying to analyze what was going on. In reality, it refers to people who are attempting to get at the activities of the oligarchy that is in fact running in America. And we'll talk about that today. That's running America from behind the scenes of democracy on the surface. And those activities have included everything from the Federal Reserve, which was certainly you could justify the use of a conspiracy in founding the Federal Reserve. Was done in secret on Jekyll Island in 1910. It was presented to the public as the undertaking of their elected officials, when in fact it was private bankers from the Rothschild, Morgan, and Rockefeller institutes who put that whole package together. The Senator Nelson Aldrich, who presented it in Congress initially, he didn't write a word of that legislation. So you can and of course, again, many of the wars, most of the wars we've gotten into have been the result of deception. So people who are conspiracy analysts look at what was really happening, the backstory behind the headline story.
Now, it's important to distinguish, it seems like something the CIA would come up with. This document's actually been released. It's document 10350. It is with regard to criticism of the Warren Commission. People, for some reason, questioned why a bullet coming from behind Kennedy sent his head back into the left. James, what are some historical conspiracies that have been proven, and what is the proof for those?
Well, I mean, you could start fundamentally with some conspiracies that even the mainstream media accepts. You know, that would include, for example, the Lincoln assassination. I mean, nobody denies that John Wilkes Booth had co-conspirators. Several of them were hung. I mean, that's acknowledged as a conspiracy in the mainstream, but it's the non-mainstream conspiracies that we like to focus on because that's what people really need to be educated on, and that really clue them as to the nature of this oligarchy that runs America. Certainly, sinking of the Lusitania, which is the event that brought America into the First World War, is well documented as a conspiracy, even though they will put out books that deny that. But let me just get you a quote on that, and that's from Patrick Beasley. Now, he was a officer in British Naval Intelligence. He actually used to move the pieces on Winston Churchill's map when Churchill was head of the Admiralty, and that was at the time of the sinking of the Lusitania. And here's what he actually said about that event. The Lusitania being, of course, it was a British passenger ship with Americans on board, sunk by a German U-boat in the South Irish Sea, May the 7th, 1915. But Beasley said, quote, absolutely nothing was done to ensure the liner's safe arrival. I'm reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy, his term, deliberately to put the Lusitania at risk in hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Such a conspiracy could not have been put into effect without Winston Churchill's express permission and approval. And but if you go back through time, you'll find that the events that brought us into the Spanish-American War of 1898, Pearl Harbor was certainly an attack on us, but it was provoked It was foreknown in Washington, and the fleet was set up there against all naval advice in Pearl Harbor by President Roosevelt. And of course, many people are familiar with the Tonkin Gulf incident, a non-attack on the U.S. Navy, August 4th, 1964, which brought us into a war that cost 58,000 American lives. Certainly, we know that Israel attacked the USS Liberty in 1967, and President Johnson did nothing. And ironically, in response to a false attack, he starts an 11-year war. But in response to a real attack, which killed 34 American sailors and wounded over 170, he did absolutely nothing. The attack on Libya in 1986, the bombing of Libya by Reagan, that was provoked by a Mossad false flag. That was documented by Viktor Ostrovsky, who was a former Mossad officer, in his book, The Other Side of Deception. Or if you look at the first Gulf War of 91, even Wikipedia now acknowledges that the baby incubator story, which drove American public opinion in favor of that, was falsified. You had this young woman who said she was a nurse in Kuwait and witnessed Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators and they died on the floor. Well, it turned out that she was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. She was not a nurse. She wasn't in Kuwait at the time. And she was coached on how to give her testimony, tearful testimony, by the big public relations firm of Hill and Knowlton. And what looked to the public to be a congressional hearing was not a congressional hearing. That so-called hearing was actually just a staged event in the offices of Hill and Knowlton. And of course, you can go through up through 9/11, and so much has been documented that shreds the official government story of that. And of course, we know that the story of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, that was denied before the fact by Scott Ritter, who was our chief U.S. weapons inspector in Iraq, the UN chief of weapons inspector, as well as David Kay, the U.S. weapons inspector, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. So then they changed it from weapons of mass destruction to Operation Iraqi Freedom. But if you look at the statement that General Wesley Clark made in his interview with Amy Goodman, he said that in 2001, there was already a plan in the Pentagon to take out 7 countries, including Iraq and Libya and Syria and Iran. And so they have to come up with these fake scenarios like sarin gas attacks to justify these wars. But this happened again and again. And by looking at the continuity of these things, Keith, people start to get a picture. We've been lied into wars many times, and why is that? It's because the same oligarchy is calling the shots from behind the scenes. These events themselves prove the existence of invisible forces behind the democratic superficial front that we see and that we think that makes us think that we, the people, have all the power.
You know, I remember hearing that Pearl Harbor was a conspiracy and me saying, I am never going to believe that. That's complete nonsense. And then I read about, something that didn't come out until the year 2000, I think, by Robert Sinnett, where he documents the McCullen memo, which says, according to the Freedom of Information Act, he said, here's 8 ways that we can get them to make the first move, knowing who them is. Interesting connection between Iraq. It's watch out. They have WMDs. They're going to threaten us. We're just there to bring democracy for them. Watch out. The Germans and the Japanese are taking over everything. Oh, we were just there to stop the Holocaust and save Poland, when they then gave Poland to Joseph Stalin, a worse murderer than Hitler. So it seems like we see this, that they tear at your heartstrings. They're killing babies in incubators. That's what we're dealing with. And it turns out, well, Saddam Hussein had asked April Glaspie in 1991, hey, we're going to invade Kuwait because Kuwait is slant drilling. What is the U.S. position? And she says the U.S. doesn't have a position, knowing full well that they would respond to an invasion. Meanwhile, they armed Saddam during the Iraq-Iran war, which has also been documented. But I want to go back to Pearl Harbor because it's so important. And you write about this in your book, The Shadows of Power, and you quote Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, someone almost as crazy as Donald Rumsfeld, it seems like. Skull and Bones member Henry Stimson. What are some of the reasons to believe that Pearl Harbor was there was foreknowledge, and it was actually planned to sort of tick at the monster of the Japanese Empire?
Well, Pearl Harbor, first of all, you have to look at the, you know what, Keith, let me just see if I can find my notes on Pearl Harbor, because I've done several shows on that. You know, you can do a 2-hour show just on Pearl Harbor. Well, yeah, I don't have my note.
Another book, just while you're looking for that, is a book that came out, I think, in 1986 called Infamy by John Toland. He's most noted for being Hitler's biographer. He has a number of volumes. It's amazing that after 40 years, he finally gets access to the 9 Pearl Harbor hearings that there were. The Roberts Commission and whatnot, but if you have some notes, I'd love to for you to walk us through that.
Okay. Now, the reason I want the notes, I can do it off the top of my head, but I just wanted the notes for the specific quotes, because I didn't know we were might go into any depth on that. Let me just see if I have something sufficient here to go on.
So here is one quote from Henry Stimson's diary. Page 75 from Shadows of Power. The question was how we should maneuver them into the position of firing the first shot. So the U.S. can claim to be, we're the victims here. Now a war is morally justified where it previously wasn't. That's from the Secretary of War in his own diary. So it's amazing that we have such credible authorities, and it's still so difficult to get people's attention on such an important event.
Well, you know, I just want to mention that knowledge of this goes way back before Toland's '86 book and Stennett's 2000 book. Actually, in 1944, the Army Pearl Harbor Board convened along with the Naval Court of Inquiry, and they both determined that the United States had full foreknowledge of. Okay, here's a nice quote. This is the closing statement of the Army Pearl Harbor Board, 1944, quote, up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. And how did Washington know about the attack in advance, Keith? They knew through 3 ways. One is the decoded naval intercepts, which Stennett covers through the Freedom of Information Act. But in 1944, they already knew that we had broken Japan's diplomatic code. It's called the Purple Code. And it was so complex it had to be enciphered and deciphered by machines. This is the code they used to communicate with their embassies and consulates. We had cracked that code. We developed our own machines, and so we're reading their diplomatic messages on a same-day basis. And that told us that their spies in Honolulu were reporting to Tokyo the exact locations of our ships in dock. We even translated their declaration of war before they handed it to us. But Pearl Harbor, the soldiers there, the sailors and soldiers were not tipped off to this. And of course, we suffered 2,000 casualties, and 18 ships were sunk or heavily damaged. So that was the event that brought us into the war, but it was foreknown. We also knew through personal warnings. If you watch the BBC documentary, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor, you can see Dusko Popov there. He was a spy who reported the attack to J. Edgar Hoover, who passed it on to the president. You can also see an interview with our military observer in Java, Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe. The Dutch had cracked Japan's codes. They warned Thorpe about the Pearl Harbor attack. He sent a total of 4 warnings to Washington until he was told by the Army Department to send no more warnings concerning Pearl Harbor. We received messages warning about Pearl Harbor from Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, from Senator Guy Gillette, who got tipped off by the Korean underground. It just goes on and on. You read these books, but it goes back. And in 1947, you had, let me just reach over here. You had, this is a new cover, but it's Pearl Harbor by George Morgenstern. He was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune. He documented foreknowledge at that time of the attack. So this is not new, but it's just been over the years, more information has come forward, come out as not only did new documents get uncovered, but more eyewitnesses were willing to spill the beans, as it were, regarding Pearl Harbor. But that attack was foreknown. It was also a travesty that the fleet was in there in the first place. It was put there as an invitation to attack by President Roosevelt. You know, when he made that decision in October of 1940 to base the fleet in Pearl Harbor, our fleet commander, J.O. Richardson, flew to Washington, and he gave the president a litany of reasons why we shouldn't put the fleet there. The fleet would be boxed in like sardines, vulnerable to surprise attack because Hawaii is surrounded 360 degrees by water, where if we kept it in its normal berthing on the U.S. West Coast around San Diego, there's no way you could surprise attack it because any attackers would run into commercial ships, etc., before they got to the fleet. Plus, you had to resupply the fleet over 2,000 miles of Pacific, and Japan was 37% ethnically Japanese. So if you're worried about a war with Japan, why put the fleet where it can be spied upon and be subject to espionage? Separating the fleet from their families was bad for morale. So many reasons not to put the fleet there, and the only reason that Roosevelt could give for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor, he said it'll deter Japanese aggression. Well, guess what, Keith? As of December the 7th, 1941, everyone knew it didn't deter Japanese aggression. But Roosevelt has never been held accountable by mainstream historians for making this decision. Instead, the Navy was scapegoated by what they call the Roberts Commission. It was a handpicked commission appointed by Roosevelt to determine blame for Pearl Harbor, because naturally the public wanted accountability. They absolved Washington of all blame and laid all the blame on our commanders in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet Commander, and General Walter C. Short. They became the eternal scapegoats for Pearl Harbor. But authors and their families have spent decades uncovering the truth about Pearl Harbor. That's an example of a conspiracy and an example of conspiracy analysis.
You know, the implications of the Gulf of Tonkin event are just so incredible. The fact that it's now recognized as a miscommunication, or I don't see the average historian saying this was a huge conspiracy. Lyndon B. Johnson's a war criminal. He basically just bought them off with Great Society programs and promoted big government ideologies. And now they don't even hold him accountable for lying about an event that killed millions of Vietnamese people and 58,300 Americans. And again, like you said, the USS Liberty, that was an actual attack, which he didn't respond to. So what are the implications there of a blatant example of a false attack and the government lying about it, covering it up? How are they able to cover this stuff up? The main objection is, if it were true, we would know about it. How do you answer that?
We do know about it. There have been whistleblowers for every event. There are veterans of the Maddox who have spoken out saying that there was no attack in Tonkin Gulf that night. That was the destroyer in question. Another great whistleblower on Tonkin Gulf was Admiral James Stockdale. He was not an admiral at the time, but he was a pilot in the Tonkin Gulf, and he was called to the scene of that attack, overflew it for 90 minutes, and did not see any Vietnamese torpedo boats in the region. And he spoke about that. He was eventually shot down over Vietnam and made a POW for a number of years, but he came back, wrote a memoir called In Love and War, where he described that attack in detail. If you go back to Pearl Harbor, there were many whistleblowers. For example, Captain Lawrence Safford was the head of the Navy's cryptography department. You know, sometimes they can't get Freemasons or other people who are smart enough to do something like cryptography, so they get some Christians and some honest people because they need them there. They needed Patton, they needed MacArthur. They need some good guys sometimes to win their wars and accomplish certain tasks. But those people then become marginalized. But our Pacific Fleet Commander, Admiral Husband Kimmel, was a whistleblower on this. He wrote a book in 1955 called Admiral Kimmel's Story, where he talked about the foreknowledge. And Rear Admiral Robert Theobald wrote a book in 1954 called Pearl Harbor, The Final Secret, The Washington Contribution, where he talked about Washington foreknowledge of the attacks. There's always been people out there. It's just that they don't get the attention in the mainstream media. The mainstream media continues to parrot the government line, which is really the oligarchy's line, to keep the public misinformed.
Well, yeah. I mean, even when the LA Times writes a review of The Lusitania by Colin Simpson, and they say this book has a good amount of evidence in it, even when places like the New York Times inadvertently say, the CIA funded a group and turns out there was some Al-Qaeda there. Or when Obama openly funds Al-Qaeda to fight in the war in Syria against Assad. I just see this constant pattern of the U.S. funding the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease and then claiming the Soviet Union's an enemy. The U.S. funding the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Now we're at war with Al-Qaeda from the Mujahideen. U.S. funding ISIS. I mean, it's such a consistent pattern. How is this pattern covered up and not exposed?
Again, it's media control. I'll just add one to that, by the way. In 1945, the OSS, which is a forerunner of the CIA, went into North Vietnam, and they armed and trained Ho Chi Minh's troops. This is the summer of 1945. We didn't need them to fight the Japanese at this point. Japan was already beaten. This was to drive out the French, and it helped set the stage for our involvement in Vietnam. But again, here's another example where we trained and equipped the enemy, who we later fought. It's happened so many times. Definitely a pattern, but we don't know because of media control. There's a quote that I like to give people. It's from Ferdinand Lundberg, and this quote resonates today, but it's actually from 1937. He wrote this quote: "The United States is owned and dominated today by a hierarchy of its 60 richest families. These families are the living center of the modern oligarchy which dominates the United States, functioning under a democratic form of government behind which a de facto government, absolutist and plutocratic, has taken form. This de facto government actually is the government of the United States, invisible, shadowy. It's the government of money and the dollar democracy," unquote. And, he just discovered that. He was a financial writer. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He looked at the financial records. He found out who owned who. He found there were just 60 families basically owned America. And as far as why people don't know about it, actually, I've got his book right here. And he has it's hard to get these days, but he's got a chapter in here on media control. He went from the East Coast to the West Coast through all the newspapers, the major newspapers, newspaper chains. He found that America 60 owned those newspaper chains and most of the major newspapers, which made it very difficult for people to find out the truth. So, for example, when the Pecora hearing of 1933, which was investigating banking, they found out that in 1931 and 1932, none of the 17 partners of J.P. Morgan and Company had paid any income tax. Well, that should have been a scandal, but it didn't hit the headlines. Why? Because they own the newspapers too. And that's the situation we're running into today, when it's even more monolithic, when we have 6 corporations that own over 90% of the media. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Viacom, News Corp, Disney, Time Warner, NBC Universal, and CBS owning over 90% of the media. So when people watch ESPN, they think, oh, I'm watching ESPN, but actually it's owned by Disney. Same thing with ABC News. It's owned by Disney. And you find, you're watching CNN, but it's owned by Time Warner, as is Time Magazine. So it's the big 6 owning the media. And because they have a consensus about what reality is, even though Fox will take the conservative interpretation of 9/11 and CNN will take the liberal interpretation, they both accept the consensus that 9/11 was what the government says. And so that's why you have to step outside that matrix of mainstream media to the alternative media, such as the show you're doing right here. And we have a lot of that cropping up, and there's a lot of efforts to suppress it now because the oligarchy doesn't like it. They don't like any competition. In fact, I was on a show just 8 days ago called Catholic Culture, run by a guy named Jesse Russell. I looked today, his website and his YouTube channel have already been taken down. I said, Jesse, what happened? He says he's been under attack. So they're definitely trying to take down the independent media. We're doing a better job than they thought we could.
Sure. It's funny. We get people like, I don't want to say this is a good thing, because then this channel is going to get shut down. But when people like David Rockefeller pass away, unfortunately, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, we get these 2 head conspirators that have such a history of engaging in evil and conspiring. It's like they finally go, and then we're stuck with the same thing. So it's not that there's people in power who we have to get. The problem is in the mind of the controlled. It's the people who watch CNN and do anything but laugh at it. The people who watch Fox, or you can just logically say, all right, Mr. Churchill, killing civilians is bad. Then was it wrong for you to kill people in Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, Hamburg, Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki? The fact that people can't just see through this, or the example I like to use is Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. He kills innocent people. U.S. sanctions in Iraq in the early 90s after the Gulf War killed 500,000 children. Madeleine Albright admits it on 60 Minutes. Yes. So the problem is in the mind of the controlled, the people who see it and believe it. The power is not David Rockefeller, or else we'd just be in freedom today, and we'd all know about the history of conspiracies. Who are the big players? I know your book focuses on the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. Historically, who are the big players to look at and research to understand history, and who are the big organizations?
Well, the Council on Foreign Relations, the subject of my book, they have since 1919 been the main controllers of American foreign policy. And if you look back, since I wrote The Shadow of Power, I have a newer book called Truth is a Lonely Warrior. But what I wrote back on there, I said on the back cover, I said, since its 1921 founding, what small organization has produced 21 secretaries of defense, 19 treasury secretaries, 18 secretaries of state, and 16 CIA directors. That is the Council on Foreign Relations. Their purpose has been, they're kind of a connection between Wall Street and the government, because usually you have to qualify a Goldman Sachs banker before he becomes Secretary of State. So he'll get membership of the Council on Foreign Relations. He'll attend some dinners by Henry Kissinger, and then he's qualified to be Secretary of State. And that's been the organization that they've used to dominate American foreign policy, whether the president has been a Republican or Democrat. And that is why we've seen only cosmetic changes when we go back and forth, usually between a Democrat and Republican president, because his cabinet is still staffed by the Council on Foreign Relations. But that's just one piece of a much bigger oligarchy, which is international in scope. Of course, they have organizations such as the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission. You were mentioning how when David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski passed away, it was interesting that there's a book called The Committee of 300 by Dr. John Coleman, who was in MI6, which is another one of the organizations. And the existence of that 300 was documented back in the 1920s, and even then, people who analyzed it said that when one of the 300 died, there was always somebody ready to take his place. So it does continue. It is not it's in place, and the death of one individual would not stop it. But if you look hierarchically in terms of hierarchy, who's at the top, above those more publicly visible organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations, you have the secret societies here in America, for example, Skull and Bones, and the upper, what they call illuminated levels of Freemasonry. We're not talking about the low-level Blue Lodge members of Freemasonry, but the upper levels. And above that, I really put the Rothschild banking dynasty really at the top. They've been controlling things for over 200 years. It was Maya Rothschild's wife who said that if my sons didn't want war, there wouldn't be any. And that has continued to be the case until this day. So I really think that they're towards the top of the pyramid. But of course, if you really look at the pyramid at the back of the dollar bill, that's really the eye of Lucifer at the top of that pyramid, which is not yet completed in its construction. It's a partially built pyramid on the back of the $1 bill, which that pyramid, that Freemasonic imagery didn't appear on the back of the bill until Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a 32 or 33rd degree Freemason himself, ordered it to be put there. But at the top of this conspiracy, it is Lucifer. For those who can handle the idea that there's a spiritual dimension to this, as a Christian, I've always believed in it. It's very evident from their Luciferian activities that this is a Lucifer worshiping cult at the highest levels. Now, at the lower levels, they may just think they're making money for carrying out globalist measures. But I think one of the best things for people to listen to get a feel for this, that when I'm talking about the Luciferian component, there was recently been some interviews. You might have seen them. It's with a former Dutch currency manipulator named Roland Bernard. I don't know if you've seen it. It's in Dutch, but they have subtitles or voiceovers. And he talks about how he said he was deeply into this. He said there's 8,000 people that run the world. And he talked about these people. And he said that what repelled him and forced him out of it was he was actually asked to partake in child ritual sacrifice. These things really happen. It is satanic. The stuff about John Podesta that was starting to come out as the election reached the moment of voting, with spirit cooking and the abuse of children and the whole PizzaGate thing. That is very real. These people are Luciferian, and this what we're actually seeing is spiritual warfare played out on the level of geopolitics. But for people who that is unacceptable, we can always just stick to the the false flags and what they're doing at the ground level. That for some people that would be more real. But there's no question that if you're really asking who's at the top, it is the Luciferians, and they answer to the worst and the lowest of spiritual characters in the universe.
Yeah, PizzaGate, I do not know enough about. I was aware of the spirit cooking email, which got little to no media attention. But don't worry, Khloe Kardashian's pregnant, Kim has a surrogate, and Kylie may or may not be pregnant. She was covering her stomach in the last photo shoot, so we're still up for speculation. If you just, regarding PizzaGate pedophilia, read The Franklin Cover-Up by Nebraska State Senator John DeCamp, for my viewers out there. When you see that a state senator makes these claims with someone on the inside, the guy's name was Paul Benassi, who's the whistleblower, then you can read the Franklin scandal. Evidence for this stuff that FBI, former head of the FBI, Ted Gunderson, has released.
Right.
The fact that it could be such a big story with so much evidence, and the media talks about a meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and some Russian lawyer for months on end, and they never mention the CFR, Bilderberg Trilateral Commission, Club of Rome. If you don't see this as a conspiracy of silence, which is also a video, conspiracy of silence in some way, or some sort of massive cover-up, I don't know. I don't know how else to shake you. When a state senator says there's pedophilia and Satanism in politics, and it still doesn't rile people up. A great example you can see is Barack Obama crying about children dying at Sandy Hook, regardless of whether the story's true or not. He cried because children died. Now, according to an article on the Huffington Post, 90% of Barack Obama's drone strikes killed civilians. 90% of the people killed were civilians. These people do not care. They have no empathy, and we can literally just see it in their actions. We don't have to speculate. These people murder innocent people based on lies and have no problem with it. I want to talk to you about the major whistleblowers. You mentioned people like James Forrestal in your book. Who are the major whistleblowers of history that are important to know?
Well, one certainly would be Smedley Butler. He was the most highly decorated Marine in U.S. history at the time of his death in 1940. He rose to the rank of Major General, and he wrote a book called War is a Racket, where he exposed the true agendas behind the wars he'd been involved with. And you know what? I want to give one quick example that Smedley Butler was involved with, just so people be a little bit more real to them. This is an event that is not emotional for people, and it's actually been forgotten about, but it helps tell the tale. In 1914, just before we got into World War I, we actually invaded Mexico. We invaded Veracruz, and the U.S. Marines went in with Smedley Butler, and 129 Mexican soldiers were killed, along with a lot of civilians. And here's the public reason why that happened. The public reason, okay, not the backstory. The public reason was this. Some American sailors landed in the port of Tampico, violated the city's port rules, and were arrested. Now, within 24 hours, they returned unharmed by the Mexicans to their ship. But the vice admiral down there, Henry Mayo, demanded the Mexicans apologize for this arrest and also fire a 21-gun salute to the American flag to show their penitence. Well, the Mexicans said, well, look, we'll apologize. We haven't done anything that merits a 21-gun salute to the American flag. So then Woodrow Wilson went before the people and he said, our flag has been dishonored. America cannot tolerate this insult to our flag and to our sailors. So he invaded Veracruz. Okay, that was a public story. Now, what was the backstory, the real story? Smedley Butler would tell you he refused to wear his medal for this action. The real story was this, that John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil was plundering Mexico's oil without properly compensating the people of Mexico. And Mexico had a new president named Huerta who was unfavorable to Standard Oil, who didn't like what was going on. So John D., he was calling the shots, not Woodrow Wilson, not the president. So we went into Mexico. After the invasion of Veracruz, Huerta was overthrown. He was captured. He was put in American prison where he died under suspicious circumstances. And then Mexico got a new president who was very favorable to Standard Oil. That was the backstory compared to the public story. But Smedley Butler, as a man who, as the most decorated Marine in U.S. history, no one could accuse of being a pinko or a commie or unpatriotic. But he told the truth about what happened. That's a major example of a whistleblower. Some other examples, Ted Gunderson, you mentioned, the Dutch banker I just mentioned, Ronald Bernard, Victor Ostrovsky, I mentioned, came out of the Mossad and blew the whistle in 2 books that he wrote on their activities and the deceptions of the United States. For the USS Liberty, whistleblower was Ward Boston. He was the chief counsel to the 1-week Naval Court of Inquiry. They were given 1 week to investigate the bombing and machine gunning of the lifeboats, etc., the napalming of our sailors, the murder of our sailors by Israel. And he came out as chief counsel later to tell the truth about it. So he was a whistleblower. Susan Lindauer, she has her own radio show now. Susan Lindauer was in the CIA, and she not only did she learn of the 9/11 attacks before they happened and attempted to warn the U.S. government, she was actually the cousin of Andrew Card, who was chief of staff to George Bush. She stayed out all night outside his house to warn him about the 9/11 attacks. She also blew the whistle on the fact that we knew about the fact that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction before we attacked them. Well, she wound up in a federal prison for her trouble. She's a prime example of a whistleblower. Another example would be, for example, on the Pentagon attack on 9/11, April Gallup and Lieutenant Colonel Karen Katowski were both in the Pentagon that day and said there was no evidence for an airplane there. Cynthia McKinney is a great example coming out of Congress of someone who's blown the whistle on AIPAC and its control over the U.S. Congress. She was a 6-term congresswoman from Georgia. Or how about Aaron Russo, former candidate for governor of Nevada, big-time producer in Hollywood, who was close to the Rockefellers and blew the whistle on their foreknowledge of 9/11 and their plans to microchip the population. So there's a lot of people out there. As a matter of fact, before I throw this back to you, I just want to mention to you, Keith, on my website, jamesperloff.com, I have an article that's called Whistleblowers, Not Tinfoil Hat Conspiracy Theorists. It's all quotes from people who were senior government, media, law enforcement officials, military officials who blew the whistle, not just somebody like myself who's on the outside, who's analyzing it, but people who actually were there at the time and blew the whistle. And it's just all valid, credible people who were actually involved at the government level, who saw what was going on and told the truth.
Those are all so important. And then when you hear them back to back, it just brings things together. Another one that came to mind for me, Louis T. McFadden, a congressman, who openly said that the Great Depression was the result of people conspiring and intentionally causing it in order for the banks to seek control they otherwise could not have gotten. This ordo ab chaos, order out of chaos, is constantly used again and again and again. And that's a congressman. We also have Larry McDonald, whose plane was shot down Korean Airlines by the Soviets. Another one that I consider a whistleblower is former World War II general, former U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, coming out and saying, hey, there's a military-industrial complex. You might want to watch out for it. And then just a decade later, they're lying us into Vietnam. They got us into Korea. Then they armed Saddam against Iran a couple decades later, and then fought Saddam. They armed the Mujahideen and fought him again. And then you see people like Chelsea Manning is a whistleblower for exposing war crimes. And who goes to jail? Not the people committing the atrocities, not Tony Blair, not George Bush, not Donald Rumsfeld, not Dick Cheney, but Chelsea Manning goes to jail. Now, she's now a socialist on Twitter, which drives me nuts. But still, it's great to expose these things, but it openly shows you government's not there to protect you when they imprison the people exposing their crimes. A couple historical events. You mentioned Viktor Ostrovsky from the Mossad. Now, his name, Mordecai Vanunu, is the guy who blew the whistle on Israel's nuclear facility, who was later put in jail for treason. Not for lying, for treason. There's three events that come to mind with Israel. The bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946, the Lavon Affair of 1954, and the USS Liberty. In all these events, it's Israel staging an event to blame on Arabs in order to get the US or Britain to fight a war on their behalf. They also did this when Netanyahu testified for Iraq. Do you believe there is evidence that the Israeli Mossad, along with people in the American government, staged the 9/11 events?
Yes, they absolutely did. And let me just pull out a reminder sheet for myself here. But yeah, the only real beneficiary of 9/11 was Israel. We didn't benefit. We got the Patriot Act. We got a surveillance state. We got trillion-dollar wars going. That money could be so much better directed towards our needs here at home. And of course, the Muslims didn't benefit. We've got the Arab Spring, Libya and Iraq and Syria and Egypt and now Yemen. So many countries destroyed or turned into chaos. The only beneficiary is Israel, who stood back and watched and enjoyed as we take out their enemies one by one. And this goes back, just to kind of tie this together, we know that there's a plan for world government. The Rothschilds have been behind that from the very beginning. That's what the UN was about. That was what the League of Nations was about. That's what the EU was about. The EU is a regional stepping stone towards world government, just as NAFTA was intended to become a North American Union as a stepping stone towards world government, because they know they can't get it all at once. It's a big new Brzezinski who said we can't get world government all in one step. It requires regional stepping stones, right? So every government has a capital, and the world government of the future, which they envision, is to have its capital in Jerusalem. In fact, let me just get a quote on that to make it real to people. This is from Israel Shamir, Jewish writer, in his book Kabbalah of Power. He said, quote, Palestine is not the ultimate goal of the Jews. The world is. Palestine is just the place for world state headquarters. The Jews intend to turn Jerusalem into the supreme capital of the world and its rebuilt temple into the focal point of the spirit on earth. Christianity will die. The spirit will depart from the nations in our part of the world, and our present dubious democracy will be supplanted by a vast theocratic state. Despiritualized and uprooted, homeless and lonely, yesterday's masters of the world, meaning the Christian West, will become the slaves in all but name. And you can find quotes from Ben Gurion and other Zionists saying that Jerusalem will be the capital of the world government. And that has a lot of significance with Trump's recent recognition of Jerusalem as exclusively the capital of Israel. We see this plan unfolding. The plan for Greater Israel is integral to the plan for world government. But to get back to your question of 9/11, all these wars that have been destabilizing Israel's neighbors, it was a Mossad and I believe Sayeret Matkal, their special ops operation on 9/11. Certainly Dick Cheney and other high-level officials were involved. I wrote a recent blog post called 9/11 Simplified and a follow-up called Conversation with a Pilot about 9/11. When I wrote that post 9/11 Simplified, which proposed, I think I'm the only person who's ever proposed that there were real hijackers on those planes, but they were Israeli special ops. The highest, their high-level special ops, the Sayeret Matkal. And for some reason that triggered something, because my book came under attack. Amazon raised all my books to full cover price, and then they suspended the Kindle edition over the most ludicrous reasons. Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And they made you jump through hoops to get this back on Kindle. There was one typo that they found, and some other very trivial reasons. I wrote a post about it. It's called "The War on Truth is a Lonely Warrior," but they tried to take the book down. But to just talk about some of the Israeli connections, you get the dancing Israelis. These are guys who were high-fiving each other, celebrating as the Twin Towers collapsed, and as they photographed the event. They had the camera set up before the Twin Towers collapsed. You've got these guys being released by Michael Chertoff, who was put in charge of the 9/11 investigation by the Justice Department. His mother was a Mossad agent. You've got airport security at all the involved airports run by a firm owned by Israelis. You've got World Trade Center security owned by Kroll Associates, who are Zionist Jews. You got Larry Silverstein taking over the World Trade Center less than 2 months before the event. He gets a $5 billion payout. He's such good friends with Netanyahu that Netanyahu was calling him every Sunday in the weeks leading up to 9/11. You've got a Zionist like Dov Zakheim and Paul Wolfowitz writing the PNOC report September of 2000, calling for a new Pearl Harbor, which is exactly what they got 1 year later. You've got Philip Zelikow heading the 9/11 Commission, a dual Israeli citizen. Why would you want someone with sworn allegiance to Israel, a foreign country, to run the 9/11 Commission? And you've got on Flight 11, you've got Danny Lewin, the former commando in Sayeret Matkal. Before 9/11, he had an official portrait taken. And I've got this in my the pictures in my, and I'm not the one who found them, but they're in my post, 9/11 Simplified. It is an official portrait taken in front of two panels that look like the Twin Towers. He's wearing a Swatch hijacker watch. That was the name of the watch, hijacker model watch, with the hour hand, second hand, minute hand, and date all set to 11, with a big smile on his face. And what was Danny Lewin on 9/11? Row 9 of Flight 11. And so this just goes on. I would recommend that people go to look for this article on the web, the Wiki Spooks article, 9/11 Israel Did It. It just goes on with endless documentation of Israel's involvement with, and I'm talking about the operational hands-on level. Israel did do 9/11. There was certainly complicity and help on our side of the ocean, but it was very much an Israeli operation. They did it, and they benefited. They were the beneficiaries. And when you're a police detective, what's the first thing you look for? Who had motive? Who benefited from this crime? Did somebody get an insurance payoff from the murder, et cetera, et cetera? Was you doing analytical thinking, you'll see that not only does the motive point to Israel, but the actual evidence points to Israel. So
also, along with Lucky Larry Silverstein, we have Frank Lowry was the co-owner of the World Trade Center. And Larry Silverstein talks about how he was going to go. He fought with his wife to go to the dermatologist and whatnot. Now, the books on those that really brought it together, because 9/11 Truth was, look at all these coincidences, but we really weren't getting any meat. Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World by Christopher Berlin, I believe is the book that answers all the coincidence questions. He does point the finger at the Israeli Mossad. Now, of all the coincidence surrounding it, it is not a coincidence that 3 of the 5 dancing Israelis, as they were referred to, released by Michael Chertoff, were on Israeli television saying they were there to document the event. That has been translated by Bolin. You can read that in his book. The other book that mentions the U.S. part in it is Synthetic Terror by Webster Tarpley. He talks about the 46 drills being run on the day of 9/11. This was done in order to confuse the FAA as well as NORAD, so they could not send military response pilots. Now, 4 planes gone off their routes into different directions, and the military doesn't respond. We spend $1 trillion a year. They steal $1 trillion a year in taxes to pay for this, and none of them were intercepted. It sounds very bizarre. I want to go back to whistleblowers and Zionist world government. Benjamin Friedman has come out and said, that's someone who was on the inside. He had said that the Zionists got the U.S. into World War I and World War II. Later, David Irving comes out quoting Chaim Weizmann from the World Zionist Organization, saying in one of his letters he wrote to Winston Churchill, we got the U.S. into World War I. We did it before. We can do it again with regards to the Second World War. So we see this constant pattern, and a pattern that's just, I mean, When O.J. Simpson's blood is on the glove and his wife's blood is on his sock at his house, we can pretty much come to what conclusion that is. How much more evidence do we need? James, in your talks, you mentioned The Creature from Jekyll Island is one of the most important books to read. The two I recommend are your book and The Unseen Hand by Ralph Epperson. What are some of the books you recommend that you believe are just must-reads everyone interested in truth needs to read for themselves?
Well, at the risk of self-promotion, I will mention again my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which it's an A to Z on the New World Order. It covers Council on Foreign Relations, the Federal Reserve, media control, police state, chapter on the war in Vietnam, chapter on 9/11. It covers a chapter on Zionism, covers chemtrails, weather control, a chapter on vaccines, the attack on Christianity. So I try to go from A to Z as a primer there, and it's documented, a book you can give to skeptics. But in terms of other books, certainly people can find, if you're looking for older books, Smedley Butler's book, War is a Racket, is online, and I think that's kind of a must read because he was involved with so many wars, starting with the Spanish-American. And another one amongst the older books that I would really recommend would be William Guy Carr, Pawns in the Game. I'm amazed. He was in Canadian intelligence, and I'm amazed. In 1955, he goes through all of history: French Revolution, the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. He knew it all, and his intelligence was so good before the internet. I'm just amazed, and it's a well-written book, and puts together the whole picture accurately. I strongly recommend Pawns in the Game. Another older book that I mentioned before, but it's maybe a little too detailed for people's family, is that one I held up before, America's 60 Families. This is a library copy by Ferdinand Lundberg, but if you really want to know about the early part of the late 19th century, the early 19th century, what was going on in America behind the scenes, he's a guy to read. Certainly, Creature from Jekyll Island, the best book, I think, on the Fed. For understanding the role of the Zionists, I would recommend Judaism's Strange Gods by Michael Hoffman, and a recent book by Tex Mars called Holy Serpent of the Jews. They just talk about the whole connection between the Talmud and the worldview of these Zionist bankers at the top, the actual attitude of racial supremacy that they have, and the connection to Luciferianism. Again, that interview I mentioned with Ronald Bernard, the Dutch currency manipulator. If you're looking for information on vaccines, I would recommend the documentary Vaxxed, which came out very recently, very up to date. But there's so many good references out there, so many good websites. I do on my website, jamesperloff.com, have a links page where I've tried to link to some of the best spokespersons out there on a variety of these subjects, because there's a great many subtopics to all of this that go way beyond false flags.
Another one of those topics, and I do want to close off. I want to thank you so much for your generous time. Another one of those topics that is not history necessarily. Actually, it is, because it all ties in. But another one that you don't go over in Shadows of Power is a book called Tornado in the Junkyard. Where'd you come up with that title? Why is the topic important?
Well, that book came out in 1999, and I was just I grew up an agnostic. Actually, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and eventually came to Christ, but still had all these leftover questions about, well, what about those 8 men in National Geographic? What about Darwin's theory of evolution? And I found that Darwin's theory was a house of cards, and so I wrote 2 books about it. One's a short one called The Case Against Darwin, and Tornado in a Junkyard. You asked about where the phrase came from. It actually came from a British astronomer who, Sir Fred Hoyle, was asked what the chances were of higher life forms coming about by Darwinian processes. And he said the chances were the same as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, leaving behind a perfectly assembled Boeing 747. Or maybe it was a 707 when he wrote that. So I like that metaphor, and so I chose that as the title for the book. But that is a book about Darwin's theory. And the reason that is important, Keith, is that many people gave up on God because they thought that there was no creator. They thought we came about because of the Big Bang. We evolved from apes through survival of the fittest. We were not created in the image of God. There is no creator. And once you once you make God a myth, and you make the Bible a myth. When you make the Bible a myth, you make the Ten Commandments a myth. And that's what the Rothschild elite wanted. They wanted a world where nobody would obey the Ten Commandments, where politicians would lie for them, where population control people would abort and kill for them, where bankers would steal for them. You know, they wanted the Ten Commandments done away with. And that's what was behind Darwin's theory. It was not a scientific theory. I can't go into it here, but actually, if you don't mind, I mention another broadcast. I was on SGT Report, Sean of SGT Report. We did a show. It's called God is Real. And it's actually the most watched interview in the history of SGT Report. We go through all of Darwin's theory, and the major scientific evidences to debunk it. It's had over 1.7 million views since it was posted in 2016. But people can get my books, Tornado in a Junkyard, or The Case Against Darwin, at Amazon. But it is important because it was used to remove people's belief in God. It was designed deliberately to undermine belief in God, because people had faith in science, right? And they tried to pass Darwin's theory off of science. It's not scientific. We can't go into the reasons why it's not scientific right now, but use some of those references. And I also refer my links page to some major websites that are also devoted to debunking Darwin's theory.
You know, before atrocities against people are justified, you have to demean those people. So they'll say, these Nazis are so cruel, they put Jews in gas chambers and ovens. These Germans put babies on bayonets. These Iraqis put babies in incubators and threw them on the floor. And all these terrible things. So when they demean humans by saying they're basically monkeys, monkeys aren't humans, we can do bad things to monkeys, therefore we can do bad things to humans. It's so dangerous. And then when the media says, Russia did X, Y, and Z, they're attempting to justify another world war. And when we don't value people as values in and of themselves, read some Ayn Rand, please. When we don't value individuals and we allow the elites to demean the value of life, it is a preparation for them to commit such atrocities. And it legitimizes it in our eyes, because those evil Muslims just want to kill us so they can get 72 virgins. I don't care if you nuke the whole Middle East. So it's really important. And that's why I wanted to close on such an important topic. James, any final thoughts for me, the viewers, people in the truth movement, the freedom movement? Any final words of advice for us?
Well, before I answer that, let me just pick up what you were saying about demeaning people. Darwin, that was another reason for Darwin's theory, was to make people think that men are just animals, a little more highly evolved. Therefore, it's okay to kill them like you would kill an animal for your dinner. And just an example, you were mentioning atrocity stories. Here's a picture from the War of 1898, Spanish-American War. And it's a picture of Spain, made to be it's called a Spanish brute. And it's a picture of Spain depicted as a half ape. And he's trampling the American flag. And he's got his picture on the gravestone of the sailors on the Maine with a bloody saber. And they're designed to provoke people to war. And then continue with the ape theme. Here's World War I. Now you've got the Kaiser depicted as an ape. See, the ape switched from Spain to Germany very fast. And he's got this maiden of distress in his arms. And he's crossed the Atlantic to invade America. Never mind the fact that the German fleet never left the North Sea. Outside of their U-boats, they never left the North Sea. They weren't about to invade America during World War I. Totally ridiculous. But that's an example of how they've used this idea that our enemies are subhumans. And Darwin's theory contributed to that. Closing thoughts. Well, I want to thank you for having me on this broadcast. It's because of venues like these that people can still find out the truth. As we mentioned, they're trying to suppress this, but that's actually a tribute to the success of the alternative media and really doing its job. I'll just mention my own, how people can get in touch. My website is jamesperloff.com. It's P as in Peter, ERLOFF. You'll probably have a link on your YouTube channel. I'm on Twitter as James Perloff, and The Shadows of Power is an expose of the Council Foreign Relations. You mentioned at the outset, but that's 30 years old now. My most recent book, again, is a primer on the New World Order called Truth is a Lonely Warrior. And I think being lonely is something that everybody in the alternative media and truth movement can identify with. As a matter of fact, I just published a post today before this interview. It's called 12 Angry Men and the Truth Movement. It's about the movie 12 Angry Men, and about how to reach the truth in a murder verdict, a jury member had to be the one man to stand up against the other 11 jury members and say, you know, I think we better investigate this further. And they finally, through critical thinking, work out what really happened in that murder. So that's my website, jamesperloff.com. That's my latest book. Thank you again, Keith, for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I can see that you're a very, very well-informed gentleman.
And thank you again for your time. My final thoughts are, if you still do not, or you're still not convinced by the evidence we put forth, I do believe that the elites are trying to justify a war somewhere between Russia, Iran, and North Korea. With North Korea, I hear some of the most some people being so okay with bombing them and nuking them, and they always say because of Kim Jong-un. There's 24 million slaves in North Korea. Do not bomb, kill, drone the civilians because of the evil actions of a tyrant. Same goes for Hitler, same goes for Stalin. Dear God, Richard Nixon talked to Chairman Mao, and we didn't have to go to war with them. Just because Saddam is evil doesn't mean we get to impose sanctions that kill 500,000 children. Please, if you're in the military, please pass that on. Please, anyone who's watching this, tell that to the actual people taking out these orders. I want to close there. James, thank you again for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for having such a good heart for people, and that's what drives so many people in the truth movement. Is we're motivated by truth and concern for the victims of this Luciferian oligarchy. You can be sure. You know, Jesus said that Satan was a murderer from the beginning, and he certainly was, as well as a deceiver, and we see that in the media. So thank you for caring, and thanks for having me on.
Take care.
Okay. Good night.